I want to be rich, famous, and powerful. Step on all my enemies and never do a thing. I want to be rich, famous, and powerful.
Today we'll be learning about the somewhat intimidating topic of copyright and how it applies to teachers, particularly online teachers. So, first of all, what is copyright protection anyway? Copyright law is supposed to protect creators of works so that they can make a living from what they create. So, if you are a creator of any of these things, that means you have exclusive rights to reproduce, use, perform, display, create derivative works, or transmit your creation. Basically, to make copies of your work. Nobody else can do any of these things to your creation because it is copyrighted. Boom. Unless, of course, they get your permission, and that usually involves paying some money. So, someone who writes a book gives permission to allow the book publisher to make lots of copies of her book in exchange for getting some of the money from each sale of her book. If anyone makes a copy of her book without permission or paying, then they are breaking the law and can be punished. So, how did all of this come about? Believe it or not, copyright protection was built into the very Constitution of the United States. Way back in 1787, when the Constitution was being written. There it is, isn't it beautiful? The founders thought it was important to include a clause about copyright. Actually, the copyright clause is on the second page. There we go, and right there. It says, Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. There are a couple important things to notice about this clause. First, the idea was that copyright protection must be limited to a certain period of time. Creations can't stay copyrighted forever because that would limit the growth of culture and science. The words were promote the progress of science and useful arts. Culture grows because people are able to spread ideas and music and art around for everyone to enjoy. Nobody wants the creators to starve, of course, but after a while, works need to be opened up to the commons so we can all build on, learn from, and be nourished by the creations. When works are released from copyright, they are said to be in public domain. Basically, there's this balance that we need to find. Here's my little scale here. We need to pay creators for their contributions so they can make a living. And we also need to make sure that we make progress in society, move forward. So, when does something go into public domain for everyone to use? Back in 1790, when the Constitution was put into effect, copyright lasted for 14 years. At the end of the 14 years, creators could file an extension for another 14 years if they felt that they hadn't profited enough from their works, for a total of 28 years. In 1830, the law was changed, and the original copyright protection was extended to last for 28 years, and after that, creators could file a 14-year extension for a total of 42 years of copyright protection. That's a pretty long time, right? Long enough to get your money back and make a living from your work, right? Well, in 1909, the law was changed again, slightly. This time, your extension could last for 28 years instead of 14, bringing your total copyright protection coverage to last for 56 years. Not too bad, considering life expectancy in 1909 America was right around 50 years. 1976, the law changed drastically. After this law passed, the original terms of your copyright protection was your entire life, which I indicate with an L there, plus 50 years. So, after you die, whomever you bequeath your copyright to will get your royalties for 50 years. The law also allowed works that had been copyrighted before 1976 to have another extension filed on them before going into public domain, which brought them up from the 56 years over here to 75 years. The law also added a category of copyright called work for hire, or anonymous, meaning that if you create something for a larger corporation, for example, you sign away your copyright to them, but the copyright is only allowed to last for 75 years. That's only 3/4 a century, no big deal, right? By the way, this law also added a category called fair use, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Apparently, this really, really long copyright coverage wasn't enough for some companies. 1998, they lobbied for more copyright coverage, and unbelievably, the laws were passed. Now, the law that we're under means that your copyright lasts for the entire life of the creator plus 70 years. Extensions can be made indefinitely, which effectively means that as long as the copyright holder remembers to file an extension, a work can remain copyrighted forever. Pretty long time. This infamous Copyright Act was nicknamed the Mickey Mouse Protection Act because Disney was a huge lobbyist behind getting this bill passed. The reason was that the original Mickey Mouse cartoons, created at the beginning of the century, were about to run out of copyright protection and go into the public domain. Disney didn't want that to happen, which is why they pushed so hard for indefinite extensions. Lots of people were disgusted with Disney about this. As you can see over time, our balance between money and progress has, with a little bit of Disney magic, been skewed towards money. Now, cultural and academic progress is stunted, since in many cases it's over a century before work goes into the public domain. But because we don't have Disney magic, there's not really a lot we can do about this law at this point. So, what happens if you don't comply with copyright? Let's say you buy a book and it's so great you want to share it with all your students. So you go make copies of all the pages of the book and give out the copies to your students. This is a violation of the copyright law. And if the copyright holder finds out you did this, she can sue your sorry behind. You will go to court and probably end up having to pay a lovely fine to the copyright holder. The thing is, it doesn't have to be the copyright holder who finds you out. There are royalty collecting agencies that keep an eye on society to make sure copyright law is being followed. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but my point is that even if the copyright holder doesn't find out you broke copyright, someone else might. But there's one little part of the law that can help you feel a little safer. It's called fair use. Remember all of the rights that a copyright holder has from earlier? Well, there are some circumstances in which you can reproduce, use, perform, display, create derivative works, transmit their creation without needing permission or paying money. That is called fair use. To decide if something is fair use, there are 4 criteria that must be loosely applied. The first one to consider is the nature of the item being used. Next one to consider is the nature of the use, or how you're going to use it. And generally, if something is being used for criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, or scholarship, that's where it applies to us, or research, it's more likely to be considered fair use than if you were, making copies and reselling them without paying royalties to the author, for example. The amount that you used, are you copying one page, or are you copying multiple chapters? That all comes into play in considering whether it's fair use or not. And finally, the effect on market value. Does this affect the ability for the creator to earn a living from what they created? Now, for example, I played a musical clip at the beginning of this presentation, and I do not hold the copyright for that piece of music. However, the nature of the work was that it was a performance that was publicly posted on YouTube by the performer. The purpose of my use, or the nature of my use, was to support a presentation that I am creating for academic purposes. The amount used was only about 10 seconds from a 3-minute long song, and the effect on the market value of this performance is probably not very big. In fact, it may actually increase this performer's market value because everyone who watches this presentation might like the singer's voice and feel like they want to check her out. Her name's April Stewart. I encourage you to check her out, maybe buy a few CDs or something. So I feel comfortable in saying that my use of this musical clip falls under fair use. However, even if you think something is fair use, you can still be sued for it. Does anybody want to go before the judge? I don't think so. Even if you win, just think of all the hassle that would involve. In my opinion, it's better to be as careful as possible. So now you have a pretty good idea of copyright law, fair use, how it works. So, how does all this apply to teachers? Well, before the internet came along, teachers didn't have to think too much about copyright. There were copy machines in teachers' lounges, but a lot of worksheets and such gave permission for teachers to make copies. Basically, you just had to make sure not to make copies of, whole textbooks, or, don't give out illegal copies of stuff to students. Like if you watched a movie in class, that's fine, but you couldn't make a copy of the movie and give it out to all the students. Otherwise, besides these concerns, copyright issues didn't really enter the picture much for teachers. Nowadays, though, in the internet era, teachers need to be very aware of copyright issues because every computer is an extremely efficient copy machine. If you post a picture onto a website, that picture gets downloaded onto every computer that visits that website. People you've never heard of or have a chance of meeting can find that picture and copy it onto their own computers. There's no way to contain it. Copies are everywhere. It is out of control. This brings up all kinds of questions, and it's a lot to worry about. So, for example, can I post images on my class website or blog? Can I copy entire websites? Can I paste articles onto my site? Can I use background music in my presentations? Will students be able to download things from my site, and will I be sued for their infringement? In other words, there's a lot to worry about. Well, try not to worry. Let me show you some simple concepts to bear in mind when you're teaching an online class. The first one, permission. This is the gold standard. If you want to use something in your class website, try to find the creator and get it in writing. Now, that's not always possible, of course, so there are some other ideas. Don't copy and paste stuff into your website. Put links to the original works instead. This keeps you a little bit safer because you're not actually making a copy, you're just directing students to go look at that article or that picture, whatever it is. If you do need to use a work, just use part of it. Don't use a major part of it, just small parts of it. Include citations if you want to post something to your site. Include as much information as you possibly can. Open source. There's a large grassroots movement called the open source movement, which rests on the idea that information should be free to the public. So lots of people have worked to create things that they intentionally release their copyright privileges for and make available to anyone who wants to use them. Sometimes they only release some of their copyright privileges, and they still have stipulations about how they allow you to use their work. So be sure to check. Just because something says it's open source doesn't mean that there are not any limitations on how you can use that work. For example, the most common request is for the creator to say, go ahead, use my work, as long as you include my name and post a link back to my home page. Creative Commons, the search page for Creative Commons is probably the most widely used website that lets you access open source materials. OpenTextbook.org is a good site to search if you're looking for textbooks for your students. And there are other sites as well. Talk to your students about these issues. Make sure that they're aware that they can't just go online and copy things willy-nilly and put them anywhere they want to, but that these images and articles and everything else are works that somebody has put time and money into creating, and they need to respect that. Speaking of respect, another idea is to tip your creators. So if you find something online that really brings value to your work or to your life, or that helps you out and you're really grateful for it, see if you can find the person who made it and throw them a few bucks through PayPal or whatever. It may not be much, but imagine if we had a culture of people filled with gratitude and everybody chipped in a little bit when they found something that they liked. We probably wouldn't be having all these battles about copyright and extending the copyright because creators wouldn't be worried about making a living. So I hope that helps all you online teachers out there. Some ideas on how to implement copyright concerns into your online courses. And now I'm going to follow my own advice.